Welcome to Life on the Other Side, stories from prisoners, their families, and those helping them find justice and redemption with Alec Klein. This podcast is sponsored by Republic Book Publishers, which brings you books tackling the important issues of the day, and the new book Aftermath, When It Felt Like Life Was Over by Alec Klein. For more information, please check out republicbookpublishers.com. In this episode, we hear from Lynn Christopherson, whose ex-husband, Dave Woodward, was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison before he was later released on probation. Thanks for joining us, Lynn.
It's quite good to be here.
So tell us about your life before all of this. But what was going on?
What was going on? I was serving as a deacon in the Episcopal Church. Someone had been involved in prison ministry. And so I had a heart for people and their families who were behind bars and just kind of doing the next right thing where I felt like I was being directed. And deacon who'd been taking services to a prison close to where I lived was going on sabbatical, and he wanted someone to cover his services. And I believe in doing ministry in your own backyard, so I went down to Joseph Harp in Oklahoma and to begin getting acquainted with the community and fill in for this other deacon. And that's when I met Dave Woodward.
What year was this?
This was in 1998. 1998.
Okay. And what was it like when you went in and you met Dave back then?
Well, I had been in this facility probably 10 years before, and I remember being scared going in, but then being struck by, these were people very similar to me. I would meet someone my age, and we had, common experience of history, and they had families they were concerned about. I remember being startled at, wow, these are just people like me who have unfortunately done something pretty bad and are now being punished.
Right.
So I was familiar with that. So going into services wasn't completely unfamiliar to me. And I just, it was something I really enjoyed doing.
What was your first impression when you met Dave?
He was kind of the inside coordinator for services, and we had a special event coming up, and it was his job to do the paperwork, to get the information and do the paperwork so that it would be okay for me to come in at a different time. My impression of Dave was he had a dry sense of humor. He was very engaging in an appropriate way, and very direct. He never hid what he had done. He kind of was upfront about that, but just like the other guys, just a nice guy.
What did he tell you about what he had done?
He told me he had killed someone, and he gave me kind of an outline of what happened, and he told me that just the smell of blood just gave him cause to stop. Like I say, he was pretty straightforward. He felt it was important that I knew up front.
When you say that the blood caused him to stop what?
When I say stop, I mean it brought him up short. It would be something that would immediately remind him of what he had done. And he would say, before that happened that night, he would say he never imagined he was the kind of person that could do something like that, could take another person's life. Right.
This is a complex case. I remember, I think, reading some of the trial transcript. For those listening, is there a way of sort of describing briefly, what he told you about how he got involved in this situation and what happened?
first of all, Dave was battling alcohol addiction, so that was a piece of his story. So his judgment gets impaired. Dave would avoid conflict at every turn, and even it was real hard for him to say no. And so instead of just saying, no, I'm not going to go there and do that, he would just kind of try and work his way around it.
For listeners to understand, how did Dave get drawn into a situation where he ended up killing a man? What happened?
What he told me happened was he had told me of his own abuse as a child and that kind of thing. And so when he heard stories of children, teenagers being abused, he tended to rush in and try and rescue things. And that was the situation in this case. A woman who had kind of brought Dave into a work environment told him that her daughter was being abused by her husband at the time. And then he wanted to, and this was one night that, husband comes home drunk, Dave's sleeping in the motor home, and the wife comes to Dave and says, can you help me just make my husband go away? He's drunk, he's abusive. And what Dave didn't know, and what came out in the trial, was that she would suggest the possibility of killing her husband. And what Dave didn't know, that he was not the first person she had approached about doing this and paying money to. And Dave would always say, no, I don't think so, that kind of thing. But then this night, things went a different way.
I remember reading a bit about this. He came by the house, right? And but then it turned badly, of course.
Yeah, he, as I understand it, because I have read the transcript, it's been a while. He went by the house, talked tough. He and the wife hung out for a little bit, and then Dave went into the motorhome to sleep. And of course, he's drinking all during this process. And then the next thing he recalls is he's awakened by the wife, who says it's time, and they go back into the house where the husband is sleeping. And that's when it got bad.
And this turned into a kind of a struggle to death, right? I mean, this was
a struggle to the death. Yeah, Dave. Yeah, and I think Dave would say he would do the usual kind of rough the husband up a little bit, and then the husband would go away. Well, this time the husband fought back.
Right.
And Dave got scared.
And then what?
Dave got scared, and part of the piece was there was this woman who was egging Dave on. And so Dave's trying to defend himself. Weapons would start appearing in his hand. And then he knew that the husband was mortally wounded at a point in time. And then they ended it.
Yeah. I know this is not easy to talk about. Now, had Dave had he had any problems prior to this? Any kind of criminal record?
No, he had not. And in fact, I remember when I first met him, and when our relationship changed, was becoming more than a friendship. I went to the library and I researched newspaper articles because I thought I need to know for sure. I know what David told me, and I remember reading the articles and seeing the pictures and the descriptions, because it was a 3-week-long trial, and there was lots of coverage, and trying to reconcile the person described in these newspaper articles with a person that I had met after the fact, sober, graduated from high school, or getting his GED and having been in a drug recovery program, a very different person. I struggled with trying to reconcile that these were the same people.
Yeah. And Lynn, what did you decide about what had happened, having done all the research that you did on reading all these articles and doing other research? What was your conclusion?
My conclusion was that with the alcoholism, judgment very compromised. I I believe that the wife was manipulative, and Dave was very susceptible to manipulation, especially when being told that there was an abusive situation. I think the jury was right in recognizing his culpability was very different than hers.
In the end, Dave was, as we discussed, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. What about his co-defendant?
She was sentenced to death. She was able to get on appeal a retrial, and then she plea bargained for the sentence of life without parole. She did not go back to trial.
Right, and so she remains in prison to this day on a life without parole sentence?
Yes.
Now, taking this story further, you got to know Dave while he was in prison over the next several years. And tell me about how this relationship sort of evolved. What happened there?
Just an awareness of that this person was becoming more and more important. Again, pretty good, good about keeping boundaries, not going to do anything that we knew we weren't supposed to do. And once we spoke to each other about our feelings, then I resigned as a volunteer, which I needed to do. I started visiting in the visiting room.
As a friend?
As a friend, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was interesting. Staff that had known me as a volunteer, I was seen very differently after that. I became invisible. Before there was some deference. I wore a collar. There was some deference. People would chit-chat with me, that kind of thing. But once I became a family member, I was just somebody to be processed from the outside.
That must have been a startling kind of transition.
Well, it was very interesting. I'm pretty good at stepping back and observing, and I try not to be judgmental. People are doing what they do for all kinds of different reasons, and most of them I don't know about. But it was really interesting.
Yeah. How did you manage that turning invisible? Did you do anything to deal with that situation?
I was okay with that.
Right.
I was okay with that. Yeah.
And when did you sense, Lynn, that Dave actually might be somebody you could envision spending the rest of your life with?
I think it was probably about a year and a half, 2 years afterwards. And then we did have our visits terminated for a year and a half because there was a captain who recognized me as a volunteer and thought I was breaking a rule and that kind of thing. And we had to go through it was going to be 3 years because that's the time frame that volunteers have to stay away from a facility they volunteered in. But just through my petitioning with the warden and just asking for a special visit and then kind of working through that process, telling the warden I was not going to go above his head. I was going to deal with him because that's where I was going to be living.
Right.
We got our visits back.
After a year and a half.
After a year and a half, right. And during that time, we talked on the phone and written letters.
And when you saw him for the first time after a year and a half, had things changed? Or had they progressed? Where were you with them?
They had progressed. They had progressed in that we thought we wanted to think about getting married.
Who broached that subject?
Dave broached the subject, actually.
How did he do this? What was the circumstance?
In a letter, I can't remember if it was before or after. It was in a letter after about a year. He mentioned it. I'm trying to see, and I think, he broached it, and I thought about it, and said yes. And then we recognized that once we got our visits back, we needed to spend some time, just kind of getting acquainted in a new way. Even though we've been writing and talking on the phone, we hadn't been in each other's presence.
Just to back up, so he asked you to marry him in a letter, and you responded in kind in a letter?
Yes.
This is very Victorian of you.
Oh, it is. Well, letters from prison is the last bastion of correspondence.
Yeah, that's for sure. And but what was your reaction when you first got the proposal? Were you surprised or ready?
I was ready. Yeah, I was ready.
Yeah. So no hesitation?
No.
Now, how do you explain that? Because, as you knew at the time, he was in life without parole. In other words, no possibility, based on the sentence, that he would get out. How did you picture all this, your life going forward?
I probably need to preface this with, before I met Dave, I had been a single mom for 13 years and quite content with my life. It was full, it was rich, doing good work, lots of friends and that kind of thing, but through a discernment process, kind of a sense of being called to the community, what kind of community. This is probably not a whole lot to do with what you're talking about, but thank God for editing. But, what kind of community am I being called for? And discernment was to the community of marriage. Okay. And then making a list of who I was looking for. And then, so my yes was immediate, but it was actually after a long period of discernment on my part of being called to that community. What was I looking for? I could choose. And then when Dave asked, it was like, I forgot to tell God where I wanted to meet this guy.
And did you, Lynn, did you picture that your life in marriage would be with you visiting Dave in the visitor's room for the rest of his or your life?
Well, that is what we expected. That's certainly what we thought it would look like. And there is community in the visiting room. You get to know the same people, that kind of thing. I dreamed about him getting out, but the likelihood was very dim. We got a hold of his transcript, had a lawyer look at it. The lawyer said, "There's no chance. You got to change the laws. There's no way to do this." And okay.
Well, now, if I could pause for a sec here, what does a wedding look like when you get married to somebody who's been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole? What does that look like? It
was wonderful. We, well, of course, because we were both connected with the volunteer community, any number of volunteers, we probably had 30 people at our wedding, which doesn't happen much anymore. But because of, I had a dress and a bouquet. It wasn't a typical wedding dress, but Dave was wearing his pressed grays and had a bouquet. An Episcopal priest and an Episcopal deacon officiated. One of the staff members sang a song. It was a regular communion service. Wait,
when you say pressed grays, are you talking about the prison-issued garb?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. This was back when the uniform was gray. Well, he could get it starched and creased, and I brought in a bow tie.
Ah, you were allowed a bow tie.
Yeah, I brought in a bow tie. Everybody had boutonnieres, and we had, it was in the morning, so we had fruit tarts from a bakery for refreshment, and there was a photographer, and it was videoed, and that was the last time we had communion together until after he got out.
Well, now before you go there, so you get married. You've now known Dave for how many years?
I've known him for 3 years.
And we're in, the early 2000s?
Yeah, we got married December 15th, 2001. It was December 13th. My daughter was there.
Now, at what point, Lynn, did you make it your mission to sort of become an expert, if you will, and these are my words, in the criminal justice system, in the parole board, in the ways that all of this is done? Because what I've seen of you is that you are, in fact, really an expert in all this, and you're meticulous about your note-taking and records. At what point did that all start, that you began to really focus on helping Dave regain his freedom?
He was able to get his sentence modified to life in 2012.
This is life with the possibility of parole.
Life with the possibility of parole. In 2012, that happened, I believe it was in the early part of the year, and then it was in like October. Because he'd been in at this point in time over 15 years, he was immediately eligible to be docketed for a parole hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And he made it to stage 2 in his first parole hearing.
Wow.
And I remember it was the first one. I went down to Joseph Harp and appeared, but I didn't speak for him. Our priest spoke for him. And after he was denied, I was getting ready to leave, and the chairman stopped me and said, "Don't be discouraged. He's doing all the right things. Keep encouraging him. And hopefully it'll be different next time."
By the way,
so
just for listeners' edification, the fact that he got through the first stage in some ways can be the hardest, which is just a review of his case, as I understand it, on paper, right?
Yes.
So that's remarkable that he got through that first stage, even though he didn't make it through the second stage, which was the vote, I suppose, of the parole board in person, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Wow. So you must have been encouraged by this point that maybe there was a chance.
Yes, very encouraged. And then in 2012, then he could reappear again in 2015, and a lot changed. The composition of the parole board changed a lot, and we submitted the package, and he got denied then at the first stage, at the jacket review, on paper only. And I'll always remember Dave talking about, I don't know what to do. He'd done more programs, he'd done more good time. He said, I don't know, what do they want of me? And I remember thinking, the parole process has been so mysterious to so many people. I said, I'm thinking, I'm going to start going to the meetings. I'm going to meet these people. I'm going to start paying attention. I want to find out, how is this supposed to work?
Little did they know what they were up against.
Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for part 2 of the podcast with Lynn Christofferson. This podcast is sponsored by Republic Book Publishers, which brings you books tackling the important issues of the day, and the new book Aftermath, When It Felt Like Life Was Over, by Alec Klein. For more information, please check out republicbookpublishers.com. Thank you for joining us today. Please stay tuned for our next podcast involving stories from prisoners, their families, and those helping them find justice and redemption. And please subscribe to the Life on the Other Side podcast on iTunes.